Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to keep an on-time airline here, and these gentlemen are sitting like the proverbial French fries under the heat lamp, so we're going to just start a minute or so early. Before we can really have a substantial discussion on the benefits and the values of proactive safety programs, proactive use of data, we have to kind of take a building block approach, right? And talk about what kind of hurdles we face in standing up these programs in the first place before we start talking about next steps. I think that it's very appropriate that we have Captain Don Wykoff joining us here to moderate this discussion and talk about some of the foundational issues with starting up safety programs. So over to you, Don.
Thanks, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and I think we've got a really nice panel to get things kicked off for us. So what's the best way to get from where we are to where we want to go? And really like any other project, we're going to need goals, objectives, and milestones. So our first panel here this morning will discuss the challenges, technical, cultural, economic, organizational, and so on. And I know from the standpoint, and this will sound like I'm a vendor or something, as a data supplier for the programs, in other words, as a data point in the system here, what's important to me is I know the program has been well thought out. It has a high probability of producing something positive. And most importantly, my input will be treated as the observation of a safety professional with improving safety in mind and truly used for no other purpose than that. Other organizations we have here on the panel and around the room have their own list of priorities, some of which are easy to address and others not so much. But we know that there are good programs out there. We know they work. So our task here today is to discuss what stands between us and the perfect safety program. Pretty simple, right? Our panelists this morning represent several segments of the government-industry partnership that's clearly one of the key elements. So let's get started. And I'd like to get started this morning as we run down each of our panelists here. It'll take 10, 15 minutes to kind of present their views on this, and then we can have plenty of time for some question and answer. I've got a few. Hopefully that you have a few, whether you care to step to a microphone or on the little tent card in front of you to text a question, and we can have that read for our panel as well. So let's get started, and first I'd like to introduce Mr. Mark Millam. Mark is the Managing Director of Safety for Airlines for America. Mark?
Good morning, and thank you. It's great to be part of a group that's so interested in safety internationally as well as here in the U.S. I'd like to talk a little bit about safety and the challenges in terms of getting some of these voluntary programs in place. It's with these programs that we really get a perspective on something that would otherwise be impossible to capture. And safety reporting really, especially with our airlines, has evolved from some pretty basic and rudimentary simple tools to something that's much more sophisticated today. It may have started with sort of an expectation of telling the rest of the airline a little bit about some particular events, and has evolved away from that towards safety programs and safety reporting tools where safety organizations are now commonly an independent element of an organization, and they help to manage the program. So most airlines today have voluntary programs, and they understand more of what's in those safety programs and the safety reports, and what's being done with those in terms of progress within the airline. Where do the airlines look for the risk? First off and foremost, within flight operations. It's the strongest area where we see safety reports. But yet, even with the strength in pilot reports, there's still areas that we know when we look at kind of the overall system level of events, we know that there's areas that are underreported. So there's probably reasons behind why some folks are willing to come forward and say, here's an event that happened, and others might not. In maintenance, it's growing faster than probably any other of the employee areas in terms of their safety reporting. but it's a trickle when we compare it to some of the other groups. On the air traffic side, the FAA has a challenging job when it comes to managing separation. And that system has been in place for a few years, and there's some really good interfaces that are now being developed between the airlines and the air traffic organization. On ground handling, we've got aircraft damage tracking and injury reporting, but there's probably a lot more opportunity in terms of learning from frontline staff just exactly what are the safety risks that they witness. And on the in-flight side, more and more airlines are building ASAP programs, and from them we learn a little bit more about medical emergencies, about an airline's preparedness for an evacuation, and often about some security concerns. So those are the areas that we're looking for risk. Those are the areas where we're gathering safety reports. And so the next thing is, what do we know about these risks from the precursors? And overwhelmingly, across all of those employee groups, that despite our best efforts to do training and continually enhance training, there's always going to be errors and some mishaps that occur. The good part of that is the redundancies that are out there in the system design are very effective in capturing most of those errors. But there are some reports that start to expose or help us understand potential weaknesses that might not even be related to errors. It's just the way things combine in the system. So from all of that, we know that information is invaluable. Without it, we couldn't have the strength in terms of identifying the things that we'd like to fix and mitigate. And overwhelmingly, the majority of the employee reports tell us about something that's not known from some other source. You couldn't possibly be out in the system and try to capture as much as what we learned from the safety reports that come from frontline staff. So we're getting better and better reporting. More and more people are involved. But even with that, part of the challenges to overcome in setting up voluntary programs is really kind of getting past people's fears. And the fears are really at all levels within the organization. First of all, from the employer to the employee, there are fears there, from frontline to supervisor, from company to the regulator, from the regulator to its own oversight agencies, and even at the top level, industry to the public. And those fears kind of cover the gamut. What I've got listed here isn't necessarily correlated from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. They may apply to everybody who's within the system. But the point of this is that, we have those fears that are out there. They affect our behaviors. They affect how much we really are willing to disclose, willing to talk about. And without the efforts that are underway to protect that data, those things will always play a part of why somebody's willing or not willing to participate in those programs. But above all of that, even with those fears and even with perceptions that maybe somebody's not doing the best thing with your particular safety report or within your airline, we have seen programs mature and become robust. And I think part of what really drives that is knowing that when you put something in place in terms of a safety report, that somebody's going to act on it. And airlines are using that information to solve what might be some of their unacceptable risks. There are event review teams in ASAP programs that involve both the airline management, the employee labor groups and the FAA, and they really take each of these and put some valuable solutions in place. The airlines have coupled what lessons come from that and gotten it out into safety reports and communication to flight crews as well as the other labor groups. And raw data from the aircraft through Focus systems helps to complement the data that we're getting from the employee reports to identify the real risks that are out there. So airlines are working at their level to do their part to identify these risks and put solutions in place. This helps to overcome those fears I just talked about. At the national level, as Peggy mentioned this morning, there's some really big accident category risks that are being managed through CAST, loss of control events, RNAV off the ground, and runway excursions. These are three big categories where nearly 30 safety enhancements have been added to the CAST portfolio over the last 3 years. And of those, nearly half of those relate back to airlines and their operations and training. And the world then is learning a little bit about what the U.S. is doing through its CAST program. And they've been following the lead through the regional groups that Michael Werda talked about, and data analysis through SIAS, we are also finding is spawning in other parts of the world. So to kind of wrap this up, first of all, knowing what you've got out there in terms of your risk is far better than not knowing. The safety reports that we learn from frontline staff are invaluable. But unless we protect that data, those fears may swell up and be a reason for folks not to participate. And one of the best ways for us to overcome those fears is to recognize that we're all accountable for driving that risk down and doing the right thing with the information that's given to us.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Next, I'd like to turn to Mr. John Duncan. John is the Director of Flight Standards at the Federal Aviation Administration. John?
Thanks, Don, and thanks, folks, for the opportunity to be here today and talk about this very important subject. We've been working with industry leaders for a lot of years on voluntary data collection systems, and successfully. First in 1976 with the Aviation Safety Reporting System, and then through the 90s with VDRP, the Voluntary Disclosure Reporting Program, Line Operations Safety Audits, FOQA, and the Aviation Safety Action Program. Protection, as Mark talked about a minute ago, came in the early 2000s with Part 193, and we've worked with several other programs since then, like the web-based application tool for ASAP and the Confidential Information Sharing System, and the ATSAP program that Mark mentioned also with air traffic, as well as, most recently, SIAS, where we began to share that data and use the data in a different way. Those programs have, I think, universally been considered successful, in part because, or in fact most part, because we've identified hundreds or thousands of things that we, the FAA, and the operators would not have been aware of but for these programs. We'll never know how many events were prevented by the information we were able to collect and look at. And I suspect these programs have also been viewed as a success because they have a solid track record when it comes to protecting the information. That is, ensuring that its use is restricted to safety improvements and not for enforcement actions against individuals or operators. As Mark talked about a minute ago, that's a very important piece of this. This data protection point brings me to some of the key challenges for regulators who seek to develop and run effective safety information systems. The heart of the matter is captured in the title of today's panel discussion, Challenges of Developing Non-Punitive Safety Information Systems. Since you're all familiar with the FAA's safety information reporting programs, you know that their foundation is what we have called in the past enforcement incentives. in exchange for safety information and that almost certainly involves some degree of human or systemic error, the FAA offers some degree of protection from sanctions and enforcement activity that would otherwise result. The data protection features of these programs provide that guarantee. So, while I think we can all agree that today's voluntary safety information programs are both very good and very successful, their incentive-based structure sharply illustrates the fundamental challenge for everyone involved. The challenge is the traditional lack of trust between both sides. Actually, between three sides, I think, as Mark pointed out here. Regulators don't trust the operators to come clean. Operators don't traditionally trust regulators to avoid punitive measures for those inadvertent and unintentional mistakes that are an unavoidable part of working with humans. It's just human behavior. The result is a system in which mistakes that could provide valuable teachable moments, mistakes that could be corrected before they cause safety problems, are sometimes concealed. Overcoming that lack of trust is probably the most critical and intractable obstacle in building a just culture, an approach that focuses on fixing the problem. That's the significant issue. A just culture is essential to achieving the next level of safety and building effective, non-punitive safety information and data sharing programs. There's a great deal of literature about just culture, the just culture concept, but let me summarize what I perceive to be the core elements of just regulatory culture. These elements represent a delicate balance that does not exist in the traditional compliance via enforcement regulatory culture. On one side, just regulatory culture includes recognition that errors, honest mistakes, are inevitable in today's highly complex aviation systems. We can't accept that as okay. While it's not a punitive issue, it must be fixed, and we must build barriers to protect the system from those human errors. Second, recognition that even the most dedicated professionals are human beings who can drift from full compliance with policies and procedures and processes intended to promote safety. The expectation is of, and the appreciation of self-disclosure of errors is also critical. On the other side, a just regulatory culture must include the expectation of accountability for appropriate risk-taking behavior, for inappropriate risk-taking behavior, and a zero tolerance for reckless behavior. It all sounds difficult, and it's even more difficult than it sounds. The culture and the structural challenges to create a just culture are enormous. The first and most obvious challenge is organizational inertia. As I said earlier, traditional regulatory culture is rooted in the idea that enforcement is the best or the only way to deter noncompliance. The traditional compliance by enforcement model is reactive and adversarial. And the implicit cultural assumption has to be that regulators cannot trust operators to do the right thing without the constant threat of enforcement. A second challenge is structural, or to put it more bluntly, a political factor. And here's what I mean. The complexity of today's system means that even inadvertent and unintentional errors can be have a serious adverse effect on safety. In today's 24/7 news cycle and the social media culture creates a greater pressure to act or to react to any event that appears to compromise safety. No regulator wants to be perceived as not responsive. The more collaborative prevention approach is the just culture regulatory model, which includes collaborative risk identification and mitigation along with problem solving. And that can easily be portrayed as being too soft or too cozy with the industry, creating a significant challenge. These are not small challenges. To get to the next level of safety, though, to get the information that the regulators and operators collectively need to identify and mitigate risk requires us to transition to that just regulatory culture. We need to help our employees, our stakeholders, a group that includes both operators and the members of the public, understand some fairly nuanced concepts. For example, the greatest systemic safety risk arises not from a specific event, but rather from the operator's willingness and ability to comply with safety standards, and most importantly, to operate in accordance with the core principles of a safety management system. SMS provides the framework needed to monitor and effectively identify and mitigate risk. Safety assurance is a shared responsibility, but the operator holds responsibility for safe operations. That means a lot more than just following the letter of the regulations. Because safety can be defined as managed risk, safety management is risk management. As part of compliance, the FAA expects certificate holders to implement risk controls appropriate to the context of their operational environment. That includes practices and procedures that encourage reporting. That said, the FAA must be prepared to take corrective action when any certificate holder cannot or will not fulfill its duty to perform with the highest degree of safety. So what does that mean? Part of the necessary cultural change for both the regulator and the operator, and don't misunderstand, it's a huge cultural change for us, is to understand the difference between accountability, which accepts responsibility and looks forward, and blame, which focuses on punishment for what has already occurred. Part of the just culture involves determining where the line should be drawn between unacceptable behavior and blameless, unsafe acts. Figuring out who draws that line and where it is drawn is not a task that can be accomplished simply. A key question involves the operator's compliance posture. The outcome of an event is not what should determine whether or not the behavior is acceptable or unacceptable. We must discard both the no harm, no foul idea, as well as the mindset that individuals should be punished if the event involves an injury, incident, or accident. Neither of these approaches get to the right place. Rather, if an infraction is unintentional and accidental, a just culture calls for first attempting to resolve the issue via positive corrective action. Especially in cases where the operator's ability to comply is in question due to insufficient knowledge or skill, corrective action would likely include training. If, on the other hand, the infraction is a willful or flagrant violation, the FAA must pursue enforcement action aimed at achieving rapid compliance and eliminating the safety risk. As the literature notes, just culture was never intended to be completely non-punitive. Sanctions must be an option for willful, reckless behavior. If we as a regulator can successfully make these determinations, then we have created a structure in which the large majority of unsafe acts can be reported without fear of sanction. Once this critical trust has been established, the operator can more easily develop a reporting culture, a structure that provides accessible memory, which is the essential underpinning of a learning culture. The bottom line, regulators and operators share the same goal, a safe and efficient system. To achieve the desired level of safety, we need to move beyond the traditional government industry model and into the which is often adversarial in nature. We must all work together to fix the problem, to fix the system. Only in an environment of mutual trust and respect will certificated operations and airmen continue their voluntary compliance with safety standards, which have made the country's aviation system as safe as it is today. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Next, I'd like to turn to Captain John Illson, who is the Chief of the Integrated Safety Management of the Air Navigation Bureau at ICAO. John?
Thank you, Don, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for including ICAO. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and we appreciate being part of the discussion. Our involvement in these types of conferences is something we'd like to do more often. Of course, it's always subject to time and budgetary constraints, but we're certainly grateful for the opportunity. At ICAO, just to give everyone our perspective, we're an organization of states, 191 member states. We are a UN agency located with our headquarters in Montreal. And our role is a bit unique. We are not a regulatory authority. We set standards for the global aviation community. And as part of that effort, we, like every organization, and I'm sure here today, we have a safety strategy, which we call the Global Aviation Safety Plan, a rather unfortunate acronym of GASP. But within that plan, there are some key safety enablers, and I think two of them are particularly relevant today. One is collaboration, and we've heard that over and over again from the opening remarks from the administrator right through, I think, everyone that's spoken today so far, and I'm sure will speak throughout this conference today, values and understands the benefits of collaboration and working together, whether it's an industry government effort and collaborative effort, or whether it's collaboration among the different member states of ICAO. And so that's the perspective we take. Just realize that when we are talking about information sharing or collaboration, we're talking about 191 different legal systems, different cultures, different governments, and that's some of the richness, I guess, of our challenge at ICAO. But it also is what makes what we do sometimes seem rather slow. Building consensus among all those member states is not something that happens overnight, but it can have a very powerful effect. And so we're focusing our efforts on collaboration and information sharing over the next few years as we move ahead. We always create international standards. They're contained in our 19 annexes, but we also now are focusing on the implementation of those standards and how ICAO can help facilitate the exchange of information among states and industry. Interestingly enough, 70 years ago when the organization was formed, within our mandate, within our charter, the Chicago Convention, there is language that ICAO is responsible to facilitate the exchange of information among states. I think it's rather prophetic that was included in the Chicago Convention. I don't think that anyone ever envisioned we'd be talking about programs such as ASIAS or sharing focal information the way it's being done here in North America through the Pan American Regional Aviation Safety Group, et cetera. But that's how it's evolved, and we're very happy to see that. But our challenge now is to be sure that what's being done here in North America and in other select regions of the world takes on a global context so that we can share information globally. And whether you're flying internationally or whether you're flying domestically here with the United States or Canada, but to international airports with foreign operators, we think that the benefits of global collaboration and information sharing will have a positive impact on the safety of your flight and all flights in general. Let me just give you, I don't want to preempt the discussions on a subsequent panel regarding the legal protections, and I know we'll have a very detailed panel discussion on that, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the process and how it differs among states. And what seems very intuitive and natural here in North America, especially in the United States, is quite different in other parts of the world. If we just think only about the volume of data, it's staggering here in the United States. The amount of information that's being collected, aggregated, analyzed, used for proactive safety purposes is exceptional, and it's very positive. If we look at other countries, just by looking at the number of operators in those countries, you can get a very different picture. I just did a very quick back-of-the-envelope type of search the other night as I was preparing to come down here. And I looked in our database just at scheduled air operators, so it's not exhaustive, but it gives you a general idea. If we look at the number of scheduled air operators that are certificated in ICAO member states, almost half of our states, 48%, have no more than one. Either they have 0 or 1 scheduled operator in their state. 74% of our states have no more than 3. So some of the power of the analytic process and the aggregation of information that we see here in the United States is simply not possible because we don't have that kind of volume. So information is limited, and the need to aggregate information and facilitate the exchange between states becomes much more important for ICAO. So we see that the regional aviation safety groups have begun to do that. The effort in Pan America, I think, is leading the way. There are 5 regional aviation safety groups in all, and Pan America has already begun to take, I think, a very active stance and proactively looking at the data that's available and that they can bring together, and I think that's admirable. What we want to do now is be sure that we propagate that type of activity in the other 4 regional aviation safety groups and throughout the world. Our role at ICAO is primarily to standardize the aviation system and to encourage further development of the aviation system. So one of the challenges that we see going ahead, and one that we want to be sure we address appropriately, is that all of the individual state activities related to the proactive use of safety data, safety information, or the regional activities are all standardized or at least harmonized, so that we're analyzing information in a consistent manner and coming up with consistent results so that we can benchmark from region to region, state to state, and we can look consistently at what those indicators are within the global air transportation system. And so that's the way ICAO is looking at this. How are we going to move ahead? Well, we're going to have a high-level safety conference in Montreal, and just to be sure you understand the term high level in the sense that it's a ministerial level conference, 3 days of intense meetings with decision makers from around the world, and that conference gives ICAO a mandate, a strategy, a direction for the next several years on what our safety role should be in the context certainly of information sharing. And what we're looking forward to do is understanding better how ICAO can facilitate the process. We can bring states and industry together in an international context. One of the benefits we have also as a UN agency is that we have certain immunities and privileges that are afforded to our organization. And we want to see how we can leverage that to help those states who don't have the system and the safeguards that you see here in the United States or in North America to better be able to collect information, share it among themselves in a very protected environment so that the trust that the other speakers have talked about before can be built, the information can be used constructively, and that the process begins to propagate and become more useful over time. So we see tremendous benefit in taking and building upon what's being done already here and developing a worldwide system that makes the global air transportation system safer. We see that there's a role for ICAO that has to be defined by our states and in some respect by industry and organizations such as ALPA. And so we're looking to get that message and understand how we can facilitate that process. So I'll look forward to more questions and also to talking a little more about the legal protections in the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Our last panelist presentation before we open up into questions and answer period here is Dr. Hassan Shahidi. Hassan is the Director of Aviation Safety at MITRE. Hassan?
Good morning, and thank you, ALPA, thank you for the invitation. I was asked to talk about the challenges of advancing data sharing globally with a focus on Asia-Pacific region for information sharing and analysis, a case study. Just come back from a series of workshops in the region, and I hope to provide some fresh perspectives on some of the challenges in the region. So just to put things in context, the region is expected to lead the world in terms of traffic within 20 years. These are passenger kilometers in terms of billions. And you can see that it's got one of the most congested airspaces in the world. It has seen explosive growth just very recently. At the same time, the fatal accidents have been on the decline over the past several years, 5 years. 2009 to 2013 has about 0.79 accidents per million operations, and 2014 is still in flux, but is trending in the right direction. So is the time right for moving towards a proactive approach to safety through broad data sharing types of efforts? The region is in the midst of a safest period in its history. The major causes of accidents have been determined through the forensic work over the many years. And so the question is the time right to move forward with a broad data sharing initiative in the region? And so to answer this question, the region, APAC, has initiated a feasibility study through the Asia-Pacific Regional Aviation Safety Team and has asked MITRE and Flight Safety Foundation to conduct that study in the region. This is a partnership that Flight Safety and MITRE have had now together for the past year. And APAC basically has asked the MITRE and Flight Safety to look at the region, engage with the stakeholders in the region, collect the information, and do the analysis. So Asia Pacific does have a vibrant and very complex stakeholder community. It is complex in that, as John Illson mentioned, a number of civil aviation authorities, ANSPs, a vibrant and growing airline sector, and then other stakeholders as well, CANSO, manufacturers, and labor organizations. IFALPA is very active in the region, and Don, I hope we can work together in this study moving forward. Certainly IATA, as well as the Regional Airline Association. Also, there is diverse data set opportunities in the region, and it's growing, as John Illson mentioned. Some of these regions don't have as much data. Asia Pacific is beginning to get a lot of data, certainly in terms of airline safety reports. Some of these are mandatory in some of the countries, some are voluntary. There is a robust FDM or FOCA data program with many of the airlines now. They're highly equipped, so there's a lot of data there to be mined. There is opportunity with radar and ADSB data. ADSB data is growing. The fleet in this particular region is highly equipped, and so there's opportunity with ADSB data as well. ANSPs and safety reports from the states as well are growing. This is the good work of ICAO that has put the standards out there for these safety reports, Annex 19, the SSP programs. Maybe John can talk about that a little bit later on. And then there is contextual information with respect to weather and infrastructure and airspace and procedures. All of that can come together. So there is opportunity here with mining this type of data. But we also need to be mindful of just culture and what it means in this particular region. Again, as John Illson mentioned, there's diverse, legal and societal structures. There are variations in terms of culture and customs within the region, and there are deep-rooted attitudes and belief systems relating to individual and societal responsibilities. And so when we start talking about just culture and we start talking about non-punitive types of programs, I think we need to have this particular context in mind. And moving forward with any type of data sharing in the region, this is going to be a key driver. So let's take a look at the safety data sharing framework that has worked for us here in the U.S. well. Starts out with voluntary and, has been mentioned, non-punitive sharing of data and information. And then using a data-driven and analytical approach, identifying risks and causal factors, then developing solutions and implementing those solutions through a collaborative process, as Peggy Gilligan mentioned this morning, and voluntary adoption of those types of solutions. And finally, then measuring the safety improvements, understanding exactly are the solutions, if those solutions are working or not. So this framework has served us well, but this framework is not uniformly adopted internationally. And so let's break this down a little bit. In the region, from an airline perspective in the region, why should I participate in a safety information sharing program? In terms of sharing safety data, which data do I need to provide? Voluntary data, mandatory data, FDM type of information. How is the data de-identified and protected? Where is the data archived? Is it central? Is it decentralized? Do I have control over that data? Now, what type of CAA and ANSP data do I have access to as part of this data sharing program? It works both ways, perhaps. With respect to identifying emerging risks, well, how do we get agreement on risks? Peggy talked about that earlier with respect to CAST. And how do we prioritize risks? With respect to developing safety solutions, how do we make decisions on safety solutions? Is it consensus? Is it majority vote? Is it some sort of hybrid? How do we prioritize solutions? And then, are those safety solutions mandatory or voluntary? Again, this region, will have to take a look in terms of how some of these programs can be implemented. With respect to measuring safety improvements, how do we track commitments, and how do we know if, in fact, the solutions are actually working? So now let's take a look at the Civil Aviation Authority perspective. Why should I participate in a data sharing program? With respect to sharing of safety data, well, what type of airline data do I have access to? That's an interesting question. Mandatory or voluntary? Can I use this data for oversight purposes? That's a question that has been asked before, and maybe John Duncan can kind of talk about that during the Q&A. Which data do I need to provide, and where is the data archived, and do I have control over the data? So you can begin to see some of the same themes appearing. And again, with respect to the other issues, there are some of the same themes again with respect to agreements on risks in terms of prioritizing risk, from a CAA perspective in terms of agreements on safety solutions, and then tracking commitments. So different stakeholders, but perhaps some common shared issues and questions, and perhaps an opportunity to collaborate. So the scope of the MITRE Flight Safety Foundation feasibility study really centers around those kinds of issues. What is the overarching philosophy we've been talking about? Is it about systemic safety issues, or is it about individual community accountability? John Duncan talked about that eloquently. What are the important issues with respect to data? De-identification and legal protection. As John Illson mentioned, ICAO is looking at some of those opportunities with legal protection. Limitation in terms of use of data. How long can the data be kept? 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? In the US, there are some standards that we've had in place with respect to SIS, for example. Processing and archiving of data. Is it decentralized or centralized? How do you aggregate and report? Do you report by airport, by airspace, by route, by aircraft type? These are issues that would have to be looked at in the region. And of course, who has access to results? Who should have access to results at what levels? In terms of decision making and collaboration, and this point has been made now several times. First of all, how do you act on data-driven precursor results versus accidents? Is it consensus or majority rule? What does the governance body look like? Is it small or large? In a region such as APAC, there are many, many stakeholders. So, what is the right representation of those stakeholders in this process? And then, with respect to secretariat and management function, how is this going to be managed? With respect to funding, again, many different CAAs and ANSPs and airlines. How are the costs going to work? Who is going to share in those costs? There are infrastructure costs. There are various costs with respect to size of data and complexity of data. How is that all going to come together? And finally, are there benefits to a regional demonstration program of some type? SIS started, as Peggy mentioned, with 3 airlines in the U.S. 7 years ago. So is there merit to starting a demonstration project in a region with a small number of airlines and CAAs and ANSPs? So that's the scope of the feasibility study. In terms of next steps, MITRE Flight Safety are to report back to APAC, are actually doing the engagement in the last 6 months and up to September. And our report are due to report back to APAC in September of 2014, right now scheduled in Bangkok. And there's ongoing regional consultation and deliberations and discussions with the stakeholders. So again, as I was mentioned earlier, any data initiative as complex as this requires stakeholders to be working together, and so the value of collaboration, the importance of collaboration cannot be overstated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hassan. Appreciate it. Yep. So thanks to all of our panelists for their opening remarks. And as I look at the time, we have maybe just a touch over 40 minutes to maybe drill down a little bit into some specifics via some questions and answers here. So I see someone moving. I think it's Nick moving toward the microphone there. And we'll get started up. Thank you for not being bashful, so I don't have to go to the pre-canned questions. Nick, you have the floor.
Don, I'd like to drill into this. You all touched on it a little bit. The problem with is it consensus or some hybrid and how you decide whether or not you should use or not use information. On a global sense, that's important, but all politics are local. And what we struggle with here, even in this country, and in fact, recently in Canada, we're finding it as well, some inconsistencies in voluntary reporting programs' reactions from those who we report to. It's important in a just culture, going back to Sidney Decker's work, that we understand as a reporter exactly how the report is to be processed. So what will make it refused, what will make it accepted, and if accepted or refused, what exactly happens to me? And without that knowledge, I'm going to be very reluctant to report. And we are finding pretty big inconsistencies in this area right now. Some airlines, last night even at the bar, never had a 709 ride in the program, ever. Another airline going, happens all the time. That inconsistency, in a crew room conversation or a deadheading pilot sitting by another airline's pilot, it really hurts the system. So I'd like the panel's thoughts on how we can work to rectify that.
Well, it's like all these things. Thank you, Nick, for the question. I think it's a great start, and we can build off of that. So let me start off, and I think I'd like to start and ask two perspectives on how to look into this. Both, and I think it's probably a good one to talk about first with the industry and then with the regulator, if you will, how to take these inputs that are brought in and to be able to process them to a true end result, which I think is where you're really getting to, right, Nick? So, Mark, how about take a first shot at that one?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's different programs with each labor group, and we see inconsistencies in terms of the volumes of flow within each of those groups. And we believe that is because there's unique challenges in each of those areas, and different perceptions that kind of grow up in one part of the company versus another. And so it takes time to overcome those. But I think you've kind of hit it right on in terms of the people that are trying to participate in those programs really do need to kind of understand how does the process work. When I submit something and it goes through the review, or as you mentioned, first gets accepted, who's making the judgment on that, on whether or not it's really an error or a mistake and not something reckless. And then from there, just exactly, what are the likely outcomes in terms of, what kind of solutions will be examined. And I know there's perceptions at times, even though, I think we've made great strides in terms of advertising the non-punitive nature of these programs. When something comes back to the employee, even as simple as, here's some help and assistance for you in terms of training. Training can be perceived as something that is somewhat punitive in the eye of the beholder there. So you kind of have to, first of all, get enough of those things out there that does describe how the process works, who's involved, where can these things go, talk regularly about the history of some of the other things that have gone through the system, get that information out in the hands of the folks that are your likely next submitters of any safety reports, and work regularly with your regulator to make sure that they understand kind of what's at stake in terms of how each safety report is dealt with, and trying to form some level of consistency through specific standards and guidance that can be published to the rest of the community. So yes, part of the reason we're up here today is to talk about the challenges in running these programs. Those challenges aren't something that you simply overcome your first early years of, and then you're off and running. Those challenges are something that continue on even through some of the most mature programs. So talking more about how things have been addressed in the past, making sure that folks know who's involved and how that information is used is an ongoing and collaborative effort all the time.
Thanks. So maybe to take it in there and then redefine a little bit where we have and off of Nick's question. John, from the regulator's perspective, there's this, when we get into this data thing, I think there's a relationship that gets built, and there's the respect that needs to be built, and everybody understands, and then the roles and responsibilities. I kind of call it the 3 R's if you're really going to run down this path. What can the regulator do, and what should their role in this to make sure that the data is being incentivized, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, I'm sure, here, and then that it's being used correctly, all so that everybody that's kind of agreed on this process all kind of stays in bounds, if you will.
Yeah, a very important, obviously very important subject, and one that we need to work hard on. Fundamentally, starting from where we are right now, I think we as the regulator need to work very hard to make sure that the information that we put out is clear to our folks and to everybody else for all the reasons that were described earlier. And that we monitor that to make sure we're dealing with this, with whatever this system is, in a uniform way across the organization, in a consistent way. Not an easy thing, but one that we need to focus on. In the long term, I have to say that in the time I've worked with these systems, there's never been a technical issue that was difficult to solve. We could solve the technical issues. Fundamentally, the hard issues all come back to people. They're all people issues. They're all issues of trust. Fundamentally, that's where we start. And so, in the long run, fundamentally, we're going to have to get to a point where we can accept that we both have the same goal. We both have the same goal, and that goal is a safe and efficient operating system. Now, it's been important in the past to deal with that because of the voluntary programs we have in place now. It's going to become absolutely imperative as we move to SMS. We cannot survive as a community in SMS without improving that level of trust, without having a different relationship between the regulator and the regulated entity, for lack of a better term. We've got to do that. Not an easy thing to do, but I think fundamentally, I think the message here from me is fundamentally, as we talk about these things, I agree with all the things that Mark had to say pretty much, I think. I have to review, just to be sure. But the issue really is that we have to approach this from the beginning for what it is, and it's a people issue. It's an issue of dealing with people and working those kinds of issues, which makes it much more complex than the technical issues we've been talking about. Am I getting to your question, Don?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And maybe I'll just jump in with a little bit of a pilot perspective, and if Nick wants to reapproach and throw a little of that in there too, there is a building thing there, and that's why I think that anytime we run down a new approach on anything, and particularly in a risk-based approach, there has to be a relationship built, because we're pulling some information in from an individual that has not traditionally been used or even sought before. So there has to be a comfort level. We keep using the trust word in that, but there has to be a notion that if I'm going to, particularly if I'm voluntarily reporting something, that I know where it's going to go and what it's going to be used for and so on. And equally important going the other way is if there's something out there that a question gets asked or you know, I have a mandatory report. In other words, I have been asked a question about what occurred, that it's not, and this is the bridge we have to build, it's not a punitive. Something probably broke or is close to breaking, and we're trying to find a solution to it. So I think that, you know, all the parties have to be involved in that whole, and it's just we're developing a culture. Right. And that is, anybody now is kind of a plea for you to move to the mic for a follow-on question here, but I'll kind of continue it on a little bit here. You got, oh, here they go, they're piling on a little bit. So there is a cultural piece here, and we may, it may come up in a question, but we're even in a North American model here, we're dealing in a fairly tight cultural piece, you know, how we operate and so on. You can see we have issues on how to bridge the gap. But I would just throw out for everybody to think that it is a relationship that gets built. And we need to figure out how to do that. And I think even moving out on the international level then, and maybe I'll throw, before I come to the microphone here, throw the question both to John and Hassan is, particularly Hassan, you're out there working in a different region that it does operate different than the North American model. How are they going to bridge that gap? How are they going to have the relationship? Because it's a different mindset, as we've seen in aircraft accident investigations, for example.
Exactly, and this is a beginning, a start for this particular region. The North American model is a model that has matured over more than 20 years. These relationships have been built over more than 2 decades. And has matured nicely, and even at that, there are still challenges, there are still learning opportunities, even in North America. In a region such as Asia Pacific or in Pan America, there is a learning process that has to go on. I think that the U.S. and North America can certainly share a lot of the lessons learned that have been gained, sometimes very painfully over these many years, and can share these lessons with the region. Not that the U.S. model necessarily has to fit, but that perhaps it can be adapted in a way that's workable for the region. But I think there is tremendous amount of lessons learned that North America has gained over many, many years, and I think there's opportunity to share that with the region.
John, anything else to add before we go to a question from the floor?
Just very briefly to certainly we have to continue to build trust, and I think we all accept that. I would argue also that we have to demonstrate benefits, and I think once the people that are providing this voluntary information see that it's being put to good use and there's some actionable outcome that actually improves the system, that improves the safety of their work as well, and that will certainly go a long way in promoting the reporting of information. So I think the project that Flight Safety Foundation and MITRE are engaged in right now in demonstrating feasibility and benefits is absolutely essential. Just to share one quick anecdote, I had a staff member from a different region of the world, very different, and we were talking about her performance review one day, and normal routine part of our management process at ICAO. And from my experience, one of the questions that you would ask as a manager is, how am I doing? Am I supporting you? Are you getting everything you need? And I think for most of the people in this room, hopefully everyone, that seems fairly intuitive. And she refused to answer. So I asked whether or not she had any issues, and she refused to tell me that. So I said, well, can you at least tell me I'm doing a good job? And she refused to tell me that. So just to make the point that in some cultures, even providing that type of information, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral, is not an intuitive process right now. And I think we have to understand that as we think globally, and that's part of the process for ICAO. So I'll just add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'd like to stick on this topic for just a minute. Dr. Shahidi was explaining how I feel in North America we're really, our programs are maturing to a good place. And at these national meetings we've been seeing, from where we've been going to SMS and now this encouraging step toward just culture and better use of data in a more trusting environment, we hear at the national level very encouraging philosophies and steps, and that you all are buying into this way of thinking. The thing is what Nick and myself and the cadre of safety professionals which work at the individual airlines, what we're seeing is a very interesting disconnect, I feel, and maybe my question is almost directed at Mr. Duncan in that and maybe I'm going to sound naive when I say this, but you would kind of expect to start, if you have a federal national program which at the leadership level is buying into the idea of just culture and a trust-based system where we're using data and we're all getting something from it, and yet part of just culture is outcomes, and the outcome right now we're seeing seems to be very fragmented at the local end of things, and almost, I don't know if it's at the CMOs where there's a lot more, like here at Alaska, I feel, have a more progressive buy-in and from not only our management but also our CMO and inspectors really do embrace what you're discussing. But other airlines are very far from that, and you still have at the end of the people who still have the enforcement mentality, even when above their level they're being encouraged to move over to this model. And I'm just curious how we actually move everyone. It seems how there is one overarching administration over all of us, why we're seeing such varied results down at the working level. So I think that's one of the things Nick was kind of trying to point out too.
Yeah, so let me start with the answer I usually give on this, and that is one of our challenges is that we must hire people. And people, of course, are different, and consequently we get different results depending on the nature of the folks who are doing the particular work. Secondly, this has been, as has been described here in the conversation earlier, this has been a long process. We've come from, over the last 20 years, we've come from where we were then, which was a much stronger, I think, enforcement sort of culture, to where we are today. Some of our folks have come quicker than others, and as you said, in the Alaska CMO, we've got a very strong relationship there that has been developed not only by our folks, but by the Alaska folks and all of the players in that particular mix. And that's important. It's important to recognize for a couple reasons. One is I have an obligation to drive that cultural change as quickly as I can. And that requires more than my organization, but other organizations within the FAA as well to support that cultural change. Secondly, fundamentally, that cultural change is the speed at which we can do that is somewhat dependent on the relationships that exist at those local areas. So if the relationships that exist there are such that the folks have been knocking heads for a long time and they don't trust each other, it's going to be hard to make that transition. The third element that I talked about earlier is the perception of how, or I should say, is the concept of how you will be perceived if you have that partnership, if you have that relationship. Are you going to be perceived as being too cozy with the operator? That's happened in the past. And so that creates a little bit of a sort of a structural friction to prevent that change from happening. We're working very hard to bring that change about by several different means, both at the headquarters level to create better information, better guidance that will better articulate what the FAA's position is with regard to compliance, and to move that out to the field. We understand it's an issue, and we're working it.
So, John, just as a little bit of follow-up, and I'll get to Mark. If I think about, and even this seminar here, symposium, is kind of an example, is, I think the relationship between a regulator, a pilot group, labor group, and the operator is in place. Is there any objection from you and your department that is different pilot groups and different operators try to develop that same sort of tripartite relationship building and push in that direction, is obviously, you're trying to build that culture inside the FAA. I'd like to see that culture built in on the pilot's side of the house. And then, Mark can speak to the operator's desire to do that. But I think, sometime it might we're going to have to give some gentle nudges everywhere to push people into this new, well overused word, but paradigm, and how we're going to, move forward in this risk-based approach to everything.
Well, clearly, let me answer it this way. There are 2 or 3 parties in every one of these, mostly 3, in every one of these things, and they all have an equal responsibility to step up to the plate and engage in those kinds of things. And so I will continue the pressure on my folks to make those kinds of changes and to move in the direction that we've talked about, and look for support from the other parties in those.
Mark, did you have anything else?
I just want to offer something where maybe it's another area where John and I still have some reconciling to do. But in this area, I feel like much of our success so far has come from the relationships and the partnerships that are out there. Those things have been built despite how the structure at a particular airline might be. And I think when you hear a pilot that might be concerned of a 709 ride, which is really kind of a jeopardy event, you're being kind of evaluated, and there's some determination made on somebody's part to say, is this pilot qualified to be flying in the seat that he's flying in? It comes from the structure that was in place long before, before the SMS sort of programs were kind of put out there. And the FAA has really asked the airlines to put themselves into these risk management systems and safety management systems through their pilot programs long ago. But I think we're still seeing at the airlines some areas where there could be policies that are changed, advisory circulars are changed that could better align with SMS programs because they were built more in an enforcement world. And so where there's folks out there within the FAA, they're willing to kind of move forward. They sense what we're trying to get to in terms of just culture. They overcome, where they're at and make those things happen. But for the entire nation to really get to that level of consistency, it's going to take some changes in the language. It's going to take some policies that really get us to SMS. And generally for the airlines, when they went through the FAA's pilot program themselves, the policy piece of it was one of the first things that really had to be done to effectively push out an SMS. So A4A is kind of advocating, it's time for the FAA to kind of think of themselves going through that same sort of evolution, and we'd like to see some of the same policy changes that have to take place as well.
Sorry, Mark, we don't disagree. That's exactly what I was trying to articulate, is that we clearly have policies in place with in-flight standards and exterior to flight standards that drive some things we don't want to drive, or that drive them in a different way than we would like to drive them. Fundamentally, we all got to start at the same place, and that is our work is to identify the problems that exist and fix them. And there's some accountability associated with that. Exactly how that plays out needs to be worked so that it does appear just to everybody. So it is just, and it appears just to everybody. But that accountability exists.
Yeah. Let me come over here. Jim?
I don't want to step in front, but if it's okay, then I'll go ahead. I know that we all kind of look at this through our own prism that's kind of based on our personal experiences. But the just culture that we're talking about, I think it's really key, what you just said, John, talking about the appearance, because we have to feel like it's just not just know that it's just. And unfortunately, I come from an airline where we unfortunately went through it, what I know at least was the appearance of it being unjust and someone being pulled out of an ASAP program after they had been in it, and it caused a sort of temporary hold to where we were and being able to file ASAP. And I guess where I come from is a military background where I really appreciated the safety culture we had, which was completely separate from, and I won't get into the Uniform Code of Military Justice side of it, but where we had a separate investigation for anything that was going to be punitive. But what was wonderful about the way that system worked was any investigation that was done related to what I would call the equivalent of an ASAP or any safety reports that were put in, that was done by a safety person. And if they ever got to a point where they were going to ask you questions, completely different people were going to ask you questions about the event that led to what could become punitive, they literally said, okay, raise your right hand, we're about to do something different, completely different people. My question, I guess, is there any way that the FAA can look at going, look, if someone's put in an ASAP and there's potential here for this to being irresponsible behavior or reckless behavior, where we're going to have to start looking at this line, the people that are conducting that investigation, the people that are doing that data, have to be separated. So there can't be that appearance of we're pulling the data from the safety department where you were brought in and asked, hey, could you talk a little more about this event? Because what you said in your ASAP didn't cover everything, doesn't answer all our questions. And then immediately after that meeting be told, well, you said a couple things that we're now going to use when you're in for a safety investigation to go after you in a punitive way. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think I understand what you're describing. The basic answer to your specific question is I don't know. I don't know whether we have the wherewithal to do that. I don't know whether that's the right methodology for us. Clearly, the outcome you're describing is exactly the outcome we're going for. When you described an event where we did the safety analysis, and as part of the safety analysis, we basically said, but there are a couple little things that we can get you on, so we're going to get you on these. That's not appropriate. That's not what we're about. That's not what we want to do. So we do want to evolve our policies and procedures to prevent that kind of thing from happening, to create a situation where we are fixing the problem primarily. And we can then use our resources that are associated with enforcement for those folks who are either non-compliant, intentionally non-compliant, not cooperative, those kinds of folks that none of us in this room want in the business and doing the kinds of things that they do. So that's where we're headed for. The exact methodology, I can't tell you right now. It's a larger question than my organization, in fact, but we're moving and we're pushing ahead to do that. And I will say also in regard to this stuff, the first step is for me to start telling the story. And I've been doing that for a while, and we are making some progress, and we will continue to do that.
Mark, do you care to address it at all from an A4A perspective on ways that we can try to inculcate sort of a culture that's going to say this is safety and this is punitive or enforcement side from an industry perspective?
Each airline seems to have kind of developed their approaches to that and how they address issues where, there might be mitigations that really affect somebody personally. I would welcome exploring that further as, more of an industry standard, and A4A would be glad to kind of facilitate that. But at the moment, I don't know that there is anything that airlines have kind of shared to say, once you've solved the safety issue or you're making progress on that side, what do we do about these, individual issues?
Right.
And, there could be some really good methods for making sure that, those two pieces are well understood by all the people that are participating.
And one of the things that I don't know that may be interesting to explore from a previous background where you shared the ASAP type events or events similar to that across boundaries. not only share the data, but if there was some sort of A4A safety function that said, hey, we're not going to identify the airline, we're not going to identify, but we're going to talk about, here's the event, so that pilots had access to the data that not, or the stories that weren't just to their own airline, but were across the industry, that were held within the safety channels. I mean, it'd be a great opportunity to learn vicariously through somebody else's experiences than having to do it on your own.
One of the things that A4A is doing, at least within the safety organizations of the airlines, we have a flight safety committee, and that committee meets regularly to talk about and share the stories that happen from airline to airline and what was learned in that process. And one very interesting thing that they've been recently been doing is looking at what are the particular risks at a particular airport, and how has each airline kind of looked at their 10-7 pages and what's been incorporated there to kind of alert pilots to the specific risks that show up in those areas. So that is something that is just sort of still in its infancy in terms of sharing airline to airline. But we think the biggest benefit for being able to share those kinds of stories is through SIS-directed study programs. They definitely tell us a lot about what's happening amongst all programs.
No, I agree. I just wish we could share it to the pilots.
Yep. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, there's the opportunity to text some questions in, particularly anybody that might not be in the room and watching this. And I believe we have one or two of those from the back, so let me give some opportunity for those. Chad?
Yeah, Don, we've had a couple of text message questions come in. Mark, you kind of alluded to it with the SIS-directed studies, but one of the questions was, how do we safeguard all this data that we're getting through SIS for just being used for safety data instead of trying to use it for other things that other entities within the airline or within the regulator or other entities might want to use it for, like for operational efficiencies? How do we make sure it's just used for safety?
So maybe to tee that up a little bit, because I know the next panel is going to talk about that quite a bit, but it might be more of, instead of really the drilling down hard, maybe kind of some overview, kind of introductory statements, and maybe, John, maybe you're a good guy to start because you're going to sit on that next panel, or actually let me go to John Illson, and you're going to sit on that panel as kind of just to tee that up. I think the really heavy details in that are going to come out on that one, and not to take their thunder away, if you will.
Yeah, thanks, Don. We'll try to leave something for the next panel, but I think it comes back to, first of all, the key is collaboration and governance. If you have a process and a framework in place that everyone agrees to, and the key stakeholders are all involved in that process, then I think that goes a long way in ensuring that the data or the information is used appropriately. There are legal safeguards, and in fact, in the United States, you have a very intricate system of safeguards that makes ASAP work in almost all respects quite well. I hear that there are always going to be some instances in which there might be a difference of perception, a different opinion. And while we have the term non-punitive in our ICAO standards, we don't have a definition of what that means, and I'm going to leave that for the next panel. But I think having all the key stakeholders involved and having a framework that everyone agrees to is essential, so that there's an agreement and a consensus on how the information should be used.
Chad, did you have another from online?
Yeah, we have a couple others, but let me see if I can synthesize a couple of these into one. A lot of these employee groups are providing these reports. They're legitimately participating in making flying safer by providing these reports. Should these voluntarily submitted reports have to be reviewed for acceptance or rejection, or should they be automatically accepted and then reviewed and only rejected by exception only?
Let me start off. John, Duncan, why don't you start with that one?
Sure. Well, as I said earlier, the fundamental issue here is we're trying to find the problem and fix it as a community, and there is accountability associated with that. So fundamentally, the acceptance or not acceptance should be associated with whether it's a legitimate report or not, and whether the person providing the report has met the parameters. Now, it may be that the parameters need to be revisited. If there are problems there, we need to address that and see if the parameters are not associated with identifying those folks who have been intentionally non-compliant, for example, or otherwise not cooperative in the process. Maybe we need to readdress those sorts of things. But I think we would have to consider that carefully before we move to a process where we were not using a filtering process.
Thanks. Let me, over here, this microphone over on my right, please.
Morning. Thank you very much. I guess a lot of the questions that we've heard this morning have to do with sort of disconnects in philosophy. I see a little bit of a disconnect philosophy between a couple of different programs. We've talked about how ASAP does a good job generally in creating an environment where pilots can report mistakes and errors without fear of punitive action. That isn't always the case, though, in fatigue reporting. And I know fatigue is a big issue for us right now with 117 and some high-profile incidents in our past. As an industry, we're kind of all over the map on what happens when a pilot reports fatigue. Some pilots can incur a financial penalty for calling fatigue. Some pilots may even be subject to progressive discipline on an attendance program for calling fatigue. Do you think where we're at in fatigue reporting right now, do you think that's harming our reporting rate? And what do you think we need to do as an industry to sort of move us toward a more consistent model?
Mark, why don't you start us off, and I think it probably as much as anything under the kind of the notion of, is this a barrier in some of these things that surrounds that type of reporting? Do you sense that could be a barrier to getting the data flow and keeping the data flow?
Well, I think when it comes to fatigue, much is the same in terms of safety reporting, and that there are going to be concerns by an individual that, in a safety issue might have to admit their error or mistake, and in a fatigue issue might have to face some level of scrutiny on, have I done my level best in terms of managing my own fitness for duty? And it is, a shared approach between the airlines and the folks that work for the airlines to, both put out schedules that are workable on the airline side, and for folks to do the right things in terms of getting their rest and being ready to come for their assignments. So maybe we haven't had as much history with fatigue systems as we have had with the safety systems. Certainly, when you look at the history of all of the safety reporting, fatigue is definitely one of the things that might be described in terms of what generates a particular safety issue. But when somebody just kind of reaches their physical limit, they're still going to be a little bit, I think, afraid of, what if I just call up and just say, I'm fatigued? And I'm not sure how I got there, but I'm fatigued. We do have fatigue management or fatigue reporting programs in place, even before 117 came along. And we're getting information out of those programs. But as 117 came along, there was the ability to now kind of go out and take a look at schedules and declare, where's their equivalent level of safety through kind of the FRMS, or Fatigue Risk Management Systems. So it could be that we're going to see a bit of an evolution on the fatigue side, just as much as we've seen in terms of the safety side. But you're always, I think, going to be faced with some of the same fears there. And I think airlines are doing their best right now to take the information they're getting and trying to encourage that there could be more in this area. But at this point, most of what we've been using is the fatigue risk management program data, and there are trends that are identified. There are actions that are being taken on those. The information is getting back to some of the employee groups on it. And here again, I think the pilot group is just way out in front of the rest of the workforces at the airline. So I would have to say mostly it's a work in progress, and we'll see. Does it evolve much like the safety reporting has?
John, from the FAA's perspective, is there anything else you'd like to add there?
Sure. Excuse me. First of all, I have a particular affinity for the fatigue rule. I got to spend the summer with the ARC when we did that rule, and so I learned a lot. And one of the things that I found unique about dealing with fatigue was that in order to really deal with it, it's a little bit of a nebulous sort of subject. And in order to really deal with it effectively, all the parties involved had to work collaboratively to get that done. And I think the ARC was a pretty good example of that. I think there was pretty good collaboration within the ARC to come to the rule we finally got. Executing that rule requires the same level of collaboration, I believe. And like with other reporting systems, it's important that all the parties are taking actions that support the voluntary action, or I should say the voluntary reporting of fatigue actions. There are some really good stories out there. There were, before the rule actually came out, when we were just working on FRMPs. And there were a lot of operators who were modifying their schedules based on the information they were getting from FRMPs. So, I think this is a really good example of the level of collaboration that has to go on between all of the parties to this kind of agreement, particularly as we move to SMS. I think this just illustrates how we're going to have to behave around FRMS. And it will probably it's a cultural issue, no question, and we're going to have to learn over time how to properly balance that, I think.
Thanks, John. Last question from the microphone here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. It's David from Jazz. I'm not sure if anybody else saw the elephant in the room walking around that I saw, but I guess for the last question, this might be an interesting one. But we've talked about the industry and the stakeholders, whether it be the employee groups, the regulator, the companies. But there's this other, and arguably we've moved the needle, I think, quite far in terms of what just culture is and the philosophies and the behaviors and that sort of thing. But we have this other somewhat important stakeholder group out there known as the traveling public. And we live in a political world. This is a political nation. There's politics run our world. And I guess my question out there is we know that we can move needles like that within the confines of an industry because we're talking the same language and we're working together, we're doing things like this. But we also have a public out there that sometimes tends to have a very guttural reaction, a need for natural justice, and a lot of things like that happen. And I'm sure Peggy and John can speak to how that translates into the political machine, if I can put it that way. So while we're working on the concept of just culture as an industry, I guess I'm curious about the thoughts and how, if at all, we work on the broader culture that will influence even how the regulator is kind of pushed, if I could put it that way, to address, again, a perceived need for a punitive type of approach in this topic. So it's not an easy question, I know, but...
Well, maybe actually ask John and John to answer that, because I think it's on a, maybe the both a local and an international level, local being, the North American perspective, but I think out into the international level, it's a valid question, because I think it'd be good, and actually it's a great lead-in for the last question I want to finish up with. So let me start off with which either of John or John would like to start first.
I'll start.
Thanks,
from
John.
the international perspective, it's a very relevant question for us. And you're right, it's not an easy question, but it's one that we're looking at closely at ICAO. And again, not wanting to talk now about some of the subject matter in the next panel discussion, but once we develop the international standards related to the protection of safety information, whether they're process-related or legal standards, one of the important aspects to ensure their implementation is to reach out to the judicial authorities that will have the responsibility to enforce their state's laws and make their decisions for any cases that may come their way, and also to the public at large. But Article 1 of the Chicago Convention grants each state their sovereignty. It respects the sovereignty of every state, and so we have to work within that framework. I think that will be an ongoing effort internationally. I think that we'll have to keep at it. Forums such as this, conferences at ICAO, regional forums and conferences as well, I think are the best way to conduct that activity, promote the benefits of information sharing and then protection of safety information and the individuals that provide that valuable information to the process. So yes, it's a very good question, a relevant one that we have factored into our implementation program once we know what the standards are, and then we can begin communicating the message to all the relevant stakeholders.
So I kind of tell you the phrase that keeps popping into my mind is, if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. And I think that's the issue for us locally. We've got to make this work. We've got to work collaboratively and make this work, and we've got to tell the story. We've got to tell a story about how it's working successfully and the progress that we're making, because if we don't and it becomes a knee-jerk at some kind of major event, we will have a problem. We'll be in trouble.
Thanks. So maybe just to kind of, I'm going to steal about 2 minutes of your coffee break time here, with your indulgence. But I think we're running down a path, and because of the culture and the size of the operation and so on, to get this whole thing started. But it probably is going to be good to go back and anytime you look back over and make sure you're doing it right and kind of have a little bit of a review. Well, I think there's something out there that might help us benchmark that a little bit, and that is a combination of a couple things. One, it's happening in ICAO, and I think as a subset of that, what Hassan described as a project out in one of the regions to get this mindset started as well. And I would encourage you to kind of take a look at that and keep an eye on it. I know we will at FALPA, and look forward to partnering there as well. So maybe just to finish up a little bit, how do you see, I think we would all agree and and probably stipulate that there is a need for harmonization and the standardization of this going around, since the world has gotten so much smaller and continues to, both from the ICAO perspective and then maybe in the context of your project, Hassan. Speak to that. How do we take that first step to get this standardization going, and how do you see that going in the region with your project, John?
For us, the regional aviation safety groups are actually ICAO bodies. There's strong industry participation. MITRE Corporation's working with a number of the groups as well. They're governed by ICAO, and so for us, the challenge right now is to be sure that we're standardizing the work across all 5 of those groups. Again, we want to be sure that the criteria, the indicators, the metrics are all common, so that it's an apples-to-apples comparison when we start doing the analytical work. So for us, it's being sure that they're all working according to a standardized process, and that the analysis they're conducting is harmonized across the globe. I guess that's the best answer I can give you from a process standpoint. Maybe Hassan, if you want to talk about the Asia Pacific initiative.
Well, I can just say, returning from some workshops, I think education really is a key thing in many of these regions. Some of these regions are beginning to grasp these concepts, are beginning to learn these techniques. And so I think with the work of ICAO, IFALPA, the international organizations can really help with that education. So it starts with education. And then I think standardization and harmonization and processes, that takes time, but I think there are lessons learned. I say again that can be leveraged from North America. so that these regions don't have to go through 20 years, but can really expedite that process. Pan America is a very good example of how they've really worked in a partnership and a collaboration. So I think if there is a message there, it's really education and collaboration, which is a theme that we've been talking about.
Great. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on the panel this morning, and I appreciate if everybody join me in a round of applause thanking them for their time this morning. Sean?
Well, thanks. Hello. Thanks again to Don and his panel here for the great job. I think that's been a great way to kick off the morning. I also note that the temperature differential is about 20 degrees cooler than it was when we started this morning. So between that and the coffee break, I imagine you'll be prepped and ready to engage in the next conversation. So we're going to take a break till 10:50, so please be back in your seats promptly then.